Yeah, right. Right, so brief review, then I'll describe our latest instrumental development, which is our cryogenic NV wide field microscope that also some people also call quantum diamond microscope. And then I'll talk about the work that motivated that seminar in the first place, which is an application of that microscope to investigation of 2D magnetic materials. So this is my view of the field. So we're using this defect in diamond as a quantum sensing platform, and the field started really in about 2008. And I divided here the work done in the field around the world in two main branches. At the top, you have the tools, and that means protocols to measure different things, electric field, temperature, to perform NMR spectroscopy, these kind of things, as well as instruments, microscopy. And at the bottom, you have applications in other fields of science. So application doesn't mean it's always useful yet, but we're kind of exploring where those tools might be applied in. And that goes from physics, condensed matter physics in particular, to chemistry, to biology. And there is also a third branch, which is commercial defense type application, where it's mostly about magnetometry, building a practical magnetometry in comparison to other technologies available. Now, a group at Melbourne, led by Lloyd, has been involved since the very beginning. And here in this talk, I'll focus on some of the most recent work, and in particular, the realization of a cryogenic wide field NV microscope. And an application of this tool to look at 2D magnet, which is one of those applications which we think is quite advanced and genuinely useful to that community. All right, so very briefly, the physics of NV sensing use the defect as an optically active defect. And for sensing, what we use is the fine structure of the electronic ground state, which is spin 1. And the two key properties that we rely on are the fact that under optical cycling, we populate preferably the zero state, and also there is a spin-dependent luminescence response. That is, there is more luminescence out in the zero states as compared to the +1 and -1 state. And those two properties is what allows us to measure the transition frequencies within that spin 1 system. And what we measure typically is this kind of spectrum, an optically detected magnetic resonance spectrum, where you measure the PL intensity photoluminescence under green light excitation as a function of the microwave frequency. And so when you hit a resonance, you have a change of PL. And those frequencies, F1, F2, are described by some Hamiltonian that describe the coupling of that spin system to the environment, and that depends on external properties, such as temperature, magnetic field, electric field pressure, and that's a basis for quantum sensing. Now you can do DC sensing by measuring quasi-static shift of those resonances, or you can apply more advanced quantum control protocols to access dynamic changes of those quantities, either in the AC regime or even measuring noise at different frequencies. All right, so that's the basics of sensing. Now, how we do sensing experiments in the lab. So you have the simplest way here, which I call single point detection, is when you have your sample in a fixed position relative to your sensor. So for instance, directly prepared on a diamond substrate, or you can also place your sensor inside the sample, and that works well, for instance, for nanodiamonds inside the living cell, which is a work done at Melbourne in 2011. Now, if you want spatial information, if you want to do imaging, you have a couple of ways of doing that. And the first one is by scanning your sensor relative to the sample. So in a scanning probe microscopy type of arrangement. And the image here is a recent example from the group of Patrick Maletinsky in Switzerland, where the image, the magnetic stray field emitted by a tri-layer of chrome tridide, which is a Van der Waals magnet, which is something I'll discuss more later. So that's a pretty popular technique, but the approach we're pursuing mostly at Melbourne is a bit different and complementary. And that's a wide field microscopy approach. So the idea is instead of scanning your sensor, we keep it fixed, but we use an array of those sensors and we image them in parallel. And that means it's much simpler to implement because there's no moving parts. It's faster because you get an image in a single shot. You have access to a larger field of view as well. And the main downside is the spatial resolution that's now limited by diffraction, so 300 nanometers at best, as opposed to the scanning approach, which can go down to a few tens of nanometers, limited by the stand-up distance. And to illustrate how complementary those two approaches are, I compare here an image from our work that I'll describe later in more detail, but showing the difference in scale. So here we're looking at about 100 of micron field of view, as opposed to a few microns with the scanning technique, but of course at the expense of spatial resolution. All right, so that's the approach we're mostly focusing on, and we've been doing a lot of work at room temperature using that approach. So at room temperature, the system looks like this in the lab. It's relatively simple optical setup with a big laser and camera. And some of the applications we're looking at in the group are along two main directions. One is in biology, especially biomagnetism, detecting magnetic signals from biological systems. And a recent example published earlier this year is on chitin, which is a sea mollusk, and that's a work led by David Simpson, where they've been looking at essentially doing magnetic profiling of the teeth of that system. And that tells you about how the ion, for instance, which is what produces a magnetic signal, in what form it is. And that goes from very small particles of magnetite and ferrohydride, which produce magnetic noise, and we can detect that. And they have different spectral signatures, so we can separate them, to larger magnetite particles that become ferromagnetic, and we can detect the DC magnetic field from those. So it's a very nice way to track the maturation of the teeth and understand how that works. So that's one direction, and the other one that I'm more involved in is in device physics and condensed matter physics in general. And the main tool we use here is imaging of charge transport. And the idea here, which we demonstrated a few years ago in graphene, is that when you have a current, an electric current flowing in a device, for instance, here in a graphene ribbon, it's creating this Ørsted magnetic field, this autoradial field distribution here. And if you can image that, then you can reconstruct the current density. That's what you see here. This is a map of the current density J in ampere per meter, and with the local direction. So you have access to the full information of that current density, which can be quite useful to study transports in different type of interesting regimes. But more recently, we've been looking at an application to photovoltaics, and that just illustrated here in that picture. We're looking at full size, as in centimeter scale, photovoltaic cells, crystalline silicon cells. And we drop our diamond on top, our sensor, and we can image that with the current density in that cell under sun-like illumination. And the motivation here is that might be a way to track down location of recombination, which is of course unwanted in photovoltaics. You want to see how the charge are being separated, and you want to make sure you don't have any unwanted recombination anywhere in the device. So that's one direction that we're looking at seriously at the moment. So that's all for the overview of room temperature applications. I'll move on now to the second part of the talk, which is about a more recent instrumental development, if you like, which is a cryogenic version of what I just described. So this is the system in our lab, which is based on a closed cycle cryostat from Atocube that we received in early 2019. So this is a top loading cryostat with a base temperature of 4K with a superconducting magnet inside. And what's special about that cryostat is got an integrated optical access with a low temperature microscope objective, which is down inside the vacuum tube here. So you can see if you open up the tube that you can see there, my student unloading, you have this objective here and just underneath the sample on the piezo stack. And on top of that cryostat, you have an optical window and the optical microscope part sitting just on top, which is again our relatively simple design of wide field microscope with a laser that comes via fiber here and a camera. So same as before, but coupled to a cryostat. Now the way we do experiments, I haven't described much so far, is by two ways. We can either place a diamond on the sample of interest, and for instance here you see a picture of a sample holder or PCB where you have a silicon chip here with some kind of devices fabricated on top with contact, and we simply drop the diamond on top. And here this is a 2 mm by 1 mm diamond, and then we can image where we want. So that's one approach, and the other approach is by fabricating a sample directly on diamond, which when we can, it's got a few advantages. And that's what we did here for niobium devices. I'll describe the result of in a few slides. So you see here a picture of the diamond chip, which is a 2 mm by 2 mm square. And we directly evaporate on top here niobium devices. And what you see in the background, this loop here is in a different plane. It's on a glass cover slip. It's the microwave antenna that we need to drive the NV spin resonances. And this approach is slightly more involved in terms of the geometry here. We need to image through the glass cover slip glued to the diamond, and then we've got the devices on the bottom side here. So in what follows, I'll show results from those niobium devices, which was more of a test sample, if you like, and that's because niobium is a superconductor, type 2 conventional superconductor with a TC of 9K. So it's a good test sample for our system to make sure we can image below that 10K kind of threshold. All right, so if we place that diamond in our cryostat, first of all, you can measure the resistance versus temperature and verify that you have a transition which occurs at 9K, as we expect for niobium. And then we can do magnetic imaging using the NV. So the first thing we did is just apply a small external magnetic field and look at the response of the superconducting film. And that's via the Meissner effect and other things. And that's the kind of image we get. So here we look at the plane film. So it's an infinite film of niobium, if you like. And we apply field from +2 Gauss to -2 Gauss, so quite small fields. And we're imaging the field at the NV layer, so just underneath the film. And what you see is mostly a white background, which means it's roughly 0 Gauss. So that means there is a Meissner expulsion of the field, except in those spots, blue spots here, where there is some penetration of the field. And those spots correspond to flux quanta or superconducting vortices, where there is some penetration of the field. And when you vary the applied field, you have a change in the density of those spots, and that follows this formula here, which simply expresses a conservation of flux, of magnetic flux. And so the applied field multiplied by the area should be equal to the number of vortices times the flux quantum phi naught. And indeed, we follow roughly that relation. There is an offset from 0 applied field, but that's just from residual magnetic fields from the superconducting coils. All right, so that's relatively expected. What was less expected is the fact that when you increase the laser power used for the measurements, you remember that entire image here corresponds to NVs that we illuminate with a green laser. And we found that when you put too much power, quite expectedly, you're going to start heating locally the sample, and you quench locally the superconductivity, and you form this disk of normal niobium. And in that case, the flux is no longer quantized, so you no longer see those spots. And so that means we have a heating locally of for 5K, going from the base temperature and passing above the TC threshold. And interestingly, when you cool down again by just reducing slowly enough the laser power, you recover those vortices and you can count them all, and it's conserved. You get the same number as before, but they've been rearranged and they tend to cluster around hotspots here, and they correspond literally to temperature hotspots, as we can see from the correlation with the PL intensity, that is a laser intensity essentially. And the physics behind that is that the laser imprints a temperature profile, as illustrated here. And as you reduce slowly enough that laser power, you have regions that pass under TC, so you renucleate the vortices. But because they're still very close to TC, they're quite mobile. They're not affected by pinning yet. And so they follow the force gradient that follows the temperature gradient. And so they tend to stick to that TC boundary until the film is fully superconducting again. So that's why they end up where you have those laser hotspots. And then if you heat the entire sample again and cool down globally without any spatial variation, you can reset the vortices and get this kind of image again, slightly different in different way, but pretty uniform. All right, so that was the passive response, if you like, of the film, but we also looked at transport currents. So now we're looking at the constriction, and we inject a current, here 20 milliamperes, pretty large current, to produce a sizable magnetic field. And as I showed briefly before for the graphene example, we can measure the magnetic field and then reconstruct the current density, J, here's the norm in ampere per meter. And we can do that in different conditions, different temperature, or in that case, we vary the laser power again, and we can go from the superconducting regime to the normal regime. And we know that by just measuring the resistance, we know that here we are at the bottom plateau and here at the top plateau of the resistance versus T curve. And what we found is that in the normal regime, the current density is pretty uniform, while under TC, it's pretty scattered. And again, it correlates with the laser intensity profile. And the reason is that for a conventional superconductor, the density of Cooper pairs scale with temperature. So closer to TC, the smaller that density is. And so the current, in fact, wants to take the coldest path. And that's what we see here. And as you heat more, you spread that distribution, because in the middle, where the laser is intensity is highest, you reduce that density of Cooper pairs. So that was also interesting to see, and it's possibly relevant to apply this type of techniques to things like superconducting photodetectors, which are particularly sensitive to those kind of effects, because they are trying to detect the superconducting transition specifically. All right, so that was an illustration, more of a test of our microscope, and I'll show now results. So from the recently published work of an application of this technique to looking at magnetic materials in van der Waals or 2D kind of systems. And what motivates that is the relatively recent topic of freestanding materials, such as van der Waals materials, but not only, and in particular freestanding magnets, which have been shown for the first time just a few years ago, 2017. I should contrast that with the work that has been done for decades, looking at magnetism in two-dimensional or low-dimension systems. And for instance, here you have a spin polarized STM image of spin spirals in a palladium iron bilayer on iridium. So that physics has been quite well explored with a number of techniques. The main difference here is that there's no such thing as a freestanding palladium bilayer, if you like. So the physics of the system is dominated by interaction with a substrate. And that's where the novelty is with graphene and all those freestanding materials. They exist by themselves. They're structurally sound, if you like, by themselves, even in a freestanding way. And that means it's a very nice playground for physicists to study the system in isolation and then to stack them. And because they exist by themselves, there's no lattice matching constraint. So you can really build all kind of complex devices in a much more arbitrary way than before with growth type methods. And from that, you can also make all kind of spintronic, magnonic, and all kind of devices, look at interface engineering, and so on and so forth. So that's really what the motivation is for the field in general. An example here from one of those first early papers on chrome germanium telluride, where they exfoliated down to 2 layers here, 2 atomic layers of this van der Waals material, and show that it retained a ferromagnetic signal. So that was one of the first demonstration of intrinsic 2D freestanding magnetism. Now you have a number of techniques to study those systems, and in fact here this is a Kerr effect microscopy image, and more generally this is what we call magnetoptics to characterize the systems, which look at the interaction of light with the magnetic moments in the sample. So here you see another example of chrome triodide down to monolayer, and what you're measuring is the rotation of polarization, for instance, or some version of that. And the other class of techniques is using transport by measuring the anomalous Hall effect, for instance, where you measure resistance. And that's very useful to get the hysteresis curves, for instance, of those material. But what's common to those two class of techniques is that they're qualitative. They don't measure, they can't tell how what the absolute magnetization in the sample is. And in fact, you even have materials that might be ferromagnetic, but they don't produce any signal because there's a very weak spin-orbit coupling, for instance, or because it's not metallic, so you can't even do transport and those kind of things. So they're somewhat limited in the type of materials they can look at, and they don't give you a quantitative answer as to how magnetic the material is. Now, if you want to do that, typically with bulk materials, you would use bulk magnetometry, such as with a squid. And then you can normalize the net magnetic moment divided by the volume and get the magnetic moment per unit volume of some sort. And that works very well when you have a large enough volume. But when you have a small fragment, because that's how you make a monolayer of, say, chrome triodide, there's no way to isolate the signal from that tiny bit of monolayer chrome triodide, so there's no way to determine quantitatively the absolute magnetization. And that's where NV magnetometry comes in. It's essentially an extension of standard magnetometry techniques, but on a local level, where we're going to measure the stray field, the local near field produced by a fragment of very small size, and then we can quantify in a similar way. All right, so we work on this idea with a number of groups who make different type of materials coming from different directions with different motivations. So I won't describe them all. I'll just show 2 examples of how it looks like, how we interface a sensor with the material. And the example at the top is from a collaboration with Lan Wang at MIT, where they're looking at van der Waals materials mostly, which means things that you can exfoliate, that are layered, and you can exfoliate down to monolayer often. And you can also stack different type of materials. And then what they do is they transfer directly on our diamond chip, which makes it quite convenient for us. And here we looked at VI3 vanadium triodide encapsulated with HBN. So I'll describe results on that material next. But the other approach, as I mentioned before, you can also place a diamond directly on your sample, and that's from a work with Mark Edmonds at Monash, where we directly drop the diamond on the samples that they grew here on silicon via MBE, and that's manganese bismuth telluride, which is a topological magnetic insulator. So I won't show results from that material, but I'll show now, to describe the technique and illustrate the technique, results from that work on VI3. So again, vanadium triodide, it's a layered materials with a weak van der Waals coupling between the different layers, so you can exfoliate it relatively straightforwardly using the Scotch tape techniques well known for graphene. So crystals of VI3 are from a group in Beijing, so very recently grown material from just 2019, I think. And we got some of those crystals, and then the group of Alan Wang at MIT is doing the exfoliation and stacking and transfer to our diamonds. The process is as shown at the bottom here. They first exfoliate with the tape, Scotch tape, then release on a silicon wafer, and that's the best way to characterize the material beforehand and infer the thickness and those kind of things. Then they have a stacking process whereby they have a stamp and they pick up HBN first, then they pick up the VI3, and then pick up HBN again, all pre-prepared on silicon. And they have this stack on their stamp, and then they're just going to stamp it out on the diamond, so to release it on the diamond. So of course, there's a lot of work that happens behind the scene to get all those processes to work together. But the result is you have a stack of here HBN, VI3, HBN on our diamond, and you can prepare a bunch of them on our 2mm chip. Once we have that, we put it in our cryostat, and we can measure the NB response. And this is a typical image we get, so magnetic field map measuring here BNV, which is a projection of the field along some axes that we know, illustrated by this arrow here. That's in microtesla, it's all quantitative. And you can correlate that with the flakes as they were before transfer, so when they were still under silicon, because that's where you have the best picture of them. And of course, you can recognize a correlation. What we can do here, which is very interesting, is because we know the axis along which we measure the projection of the field, we can actually reconstruct the magnetization in the sample, which was kind of the goal initially. And that means we can go from B to M. And the only condition here for that is that you need to know the direction of the magnetic moments in the sample. And often you know because there is a strong out-of-plane anisotropy, so perpendicular anisotropy, which means we know that the magnetic moments are going to point out of the plane, so along the Z direction. And if you know that, then there's a one-to-one correspondence between the two, which is just a linear operation in Fourier space. So you get this map of MZ, which here we express in mu b per nanometer square, so number of Bohr magnetons per nanometer square. And so from there, you can analyze that kind of image compared to ab initio predictions, for instance, or to bulk results. And you can also directly visualize, compare different regions of the sample. And for instance, here, you see here in black, the contour of the HBN flakes used for encapsulation. And in fact, there is a region here which is not covered by HBN at all. So it's bare VS3 on the diamond. And so you can see the effect of no encapsulation. And here we still have some magnetic signals because that was from quite thick flakes, but they're all fragmented now. And that's because of oxidation during the few minutes it took for transferring that in our system. So it's that's enough to degrade the material pretty significantly, and we can see that. Under the HBN, though, it's pretty intact, and we can also see the effect of the under layer of HBN, and you can see here the boundary of the bottom HBN doesn't do anything. There's no step across that boundary, which tells us that the magnetization here in that sample doesn't depend on the substrate, whether it's HBN or the bare diamond doesn't make a difference. So that's a very useful information to have, and that's because we're quantitative. It's not convolved with other artifacts. Now, if you want to look in more detail at the thickness dependence, that's typically a key property we're interested in. You can repeat those measurements on a number of samples and do a bit of statistics where you correlate with the thickness. And for that, you take at the top here is the optical contrast image, which you can, after some calibration, you can infer the number of layers from. And that goes, so number of atomic layers, typically 3 layers here, for instance, down to 1 layer. We have some monolayers, some bilayers there. And you can correlate that with the MZ maps. And you can form this kind of plot where you plot MZ versus number of layers, and we find from the data linear trends, and that's what you expect because that's per unit surface area. So you expect an increase, and we have a slope of here 0.4 μb per formula unit, per VS3 unit. So that's good that it's linear, but what's surprising is that the slope doesn't match what we expected from either extrapolating from the bulk results. So that's a red curve here, red line, which is 1 μb per formula unit. So that's from measuring a bulk crystal, millimeter in size. And it's also, it also doesn't match the ab initio prediction of 2 μb per formula unit, which is essentially each vanadium atom should, according to ab initio, contribute to 2 μbs. So there is a bit of a mystery here. There is a recent paper that showed that VI3 under pressure actually loses magnetization. So it's possible that in a very thin regime, there is strain, and that could explain that possibly. So that's still something we investigate, but that shows the value of getting those measurements in the ultrathin limit down to monolayer. All right, so that's, I think, the key interest of the technique, but you can also measure more basic magnetic properties, and I'll illustrate that very briefly. First of all, you can get the temperature dependence, and that by just mapping MZ again, increasing the temperature. So you can see the signal fading away and disappearing at 50, 60 K. And you can then plot MZ versus T for different flake thicknesses or different conditions. Here we haven't seen anything too surprising. The TC is about 50 K, similar to the bulk. Then you can look at the switching of this material, and that's by measuring MZ again after applying a field in the opposite direction. So that image at the left is after you magnetized, say, up, so it's all blue, and then you apply a field down, so minus 0.8 Tesla here, and you switch the sign of the magnetization. It goes from blue to orange. So that means those very thin 3 layers thick here have switched between 0.7 and 0.8, and then you keep going and switch more and more. And at 1 Tesla, it's typically borderline for this material here to switch completely in the direction you want. So that tells us that the coercive field or switching field is between 0.8 and 1 Tesla, regardless of the thickness here. There's no correlation at the base temperature here, 4K. And you can repeat that versus temperature. In that case, we found that it was in fairly good agreement with the bulk result as well, which the coercive field goes from 1 Tesla to near 0 at TC.
JP, there's a question from Stephen Prower.
Yes.
If I can just interrupt. Isn't it possible that the flakes are not azimuthally aligned?
So smoothly aligned. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's possible. Why not? Could be just from geometry that sit on a substrate. So yeah, the variation here could be due to alignment. I don't think so, but possibly. Here we haven't found any correlation with anything. So we would say it's linked to something I'll come back to in a minute. But the switching comes from nucleation of domain walls near the edges of the flakes at defect. So basically you have a maximum switching field of, say, 1 Tesla, and then if you have a geometrical effect or a defect somewhere that help the switching, then you can have a flake that's going to switch at the lower field. So I think it's more related to defect than angle considerations. But yeah, that's very possible. So that was for switching. And finally, you can also monitor the initial magnetization process, and that's when you start with a virgin state, as I call it, which is you zero field cool your sample. So you cool from above TC down to base without any applied field, and you have random domains up and down because there's no favored direction in that case. And then you slowly apply a larger and larger field to slowly magnetize the sample. And that is, you go from random to all blue because you apply a field in the up direction. And that tells you about the dynamics of domain walls, walls that separate blue from orange, and those domain walls move towards the edges until it's all a single domain. And so what we found here is that it's happening between 0.15 and 0.3 Tesla, or so 0.4 Tesla. And that gives you also a distribution of the pinning field of those domain walls, which again it's much lower than the switching field, which means pinning is irrelevant for the switching. So switching is happening by nucleation at the edges, not so much at the effects in the dark. So it's all about the edges. All right, so that's concluding my summary slide about the different things you can measure. But yeah, I think the key point is that it's all quantitative. You have MZ, and that's a key advantage we have, where you can really look at the effect of subtle effects, interface effect, and those kind of things. Now, what's next? So we are working towards in a few directions of applying the technique. One is interface engineering, for that very reason that we have an absolute measurement. So it's an ideal way of looking at the effect of stacking with different materials and resulting in hybridization effect, charge transfer effect, strain effect, and those kind of things. Another topic is materials, new materials, and in particular, one of the goals in the communities is to make a freestanding materials that would be magnetic, ferromagnetic at room temperature or above, which still doesn't exist yet. So that's really a goal, and we work with a few collaborators here that focus on specific ways of making those materials, not just Van der Waals, but also non-layer materials. And here you typically want a bottom-up approach to synthesize them. So we work with Vipul Bensal at Torben Deineke at who develop techniques to make non-layered materials in the 2D limit. And finally, spintronics is also a topic of interest for us, using electrical currents to manipulate magnetism. And again, that's something our technique is pretty well suited to, because you can look at quite large field of view, and it's relatively fast compared to some other techniques. So it's quite useful to look at a spintronic effect as well. And that's it for the science. And finally, this is a team that mostly contributed to this work, and in particular Nikolai Donchuk and my students David Broadway, Scott Liddy, and Sam Shelton. Thank you.